event conducted by class Pencerahan or Enlightenment class, or otherwise known as Students for Liberty, and with ideas.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we are very honored to have Dr. Christopher Lingle, a visiting professor from Universidad Marroquin from Guatemala.
It's not easy to
Yeah, it's not easy to pronounce the name. And he's a professor of economics, experienced in teaching in universities all around the world, focusing on political economy and international economics. And most of his research is done on public policies. So today we'll be talking about economic freedom in ASEAN, challenges and solutions. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Wonderful. Wonderful introduction. I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm sure you have plenty of things to do. And, I'm pleased to see that there's some level of interest to come tonight. I'm here to speak at this international conference on the Asean People's Forum, which is a very impressive organization in terms of their ability to mobilize people with similar ideas. Purportedly, they're an element of civil society. Now, in my view, you guys and the organization, the Students for Liberty, is one of the true organs of civil society, one of the few in the world that is true to the spirit of this idea of civil society. Because the civil society concept is that of an independent movement of citizens who are guided by some similar ideas, who organize and develop spontaneously without the support of government. It exists outside of government. That's the whole idea of civil society. And this group that we're meeting with over the next couple of days are, in fact, in a sense, whether they realize it or not, are serving governments or are servants of government because they are dependent on them for financial resources. Now, Students for Liberty, the international organization, is completely self-funded. They turn to other private funds, but they get no money, and they will accept no money from governments. So it will only come from private organizations. So I think this is an interesting development. The group identifies ASEAN as a danger to civil society, but they receive financing from ASEAN governments, which is an interesting contradiction. They identify ASEAN as a so-called as being guided by a neoliberal set of ideals. They insist that these neoliberal ideas are dangerous. Those neoliberal ideas that are supposedly at the heart of ASEAN are deregulation, privatization, trade liberalization, and so on. Now, I'm not a great student of ASEAN, but I followed ASEAN from a distance. I was a professor in Singapore, so I had some experience, and I spend much of my time in Indonesia every year. But there's no evidence that ASEAN is pushing for privatization. Privatization is not on any government's agenda in Southeast Asia that I know of, not in any aggressive manner. It's not a persistent movement. Deregulation, that is, reducing regulation, is not on the agenda, and it's not pursued aggressively. And trade liberalization, it's being talked about. It's been talked about for a long time, but it's just not happening. So, I mean, these claims that a neoliberal agenda guides ASEAN is, in my view, either disingenuous or it's maliciously wrong. Now, I would applaud ASEAN if it pursued those objectives. I think the ASEAN economies would be much better off. The economic growth and human development, not just economic development, human development, social development would be greatly advanced in the ASEAN countries if they did aggressively pursue trade liberalization, deregulation, and privatization of state-owned assets. But I don't see much hope in it, at least not in the immediate term. There's not even, as far as I can see, there's not really that much, there's not much commitment to any of those policies. Now, why do I think these countries and their economies and their people would be better off? Trade liberalization is fundamentally about allowing people to make more choices. You make more choices in the market. You make more choices about who you hire. You make more choices about where you buy your products, where you sell your products. This provides people with opportunities to improve their lives through their own actions, through their own initiatives. And indeed, it requires people to be responsible more for themselves. So this leads to human development and social development. Because trade liberalization, meaning the opening of markets, markets do something amazing. Voluntary trade in open markets opens up more opportunities for social cooperation. Because market exchange, in the end, is really about cooperation. Cooperating with other people, finding what we can do to please one another. Or what I like to, why do people go into the marketplace? You're looking for happiness, to put it in a very simple-minded sense. When you go to buy a new hand phone, it makes you happy. When you go to buy a meal in a nice place like this, it makes you happy. You feel, oh, that was good. I enjoyed that. Going into the market is about finding happiness. Now, if you're a seller, you go on the market, wow, I sold a lot today. That makes me happy. It makes my wife happy. It makes my husband, it makes my children happy. So, this idea of market trade, market exchange, is all about facilitating the discovery of happiness. Now, in terms of this idea of social cooperation, how can you be happy in the market unless you satisfy the other person? It allows mutual happiness through cooperation, because voluntary trade is literally that. I give you this for that because it makes me feel better off. And you take what I offer you because what you gave me, you valued less. So trade increases cooperation. Indeed, it increases our dependency on other people to help make us happy. We depend on other people for our happiness in the market. The market and market exchange is about making friends out of strangers. This is a positive social benefit of market exchange. It makes you less threatened by strangers, because you see the stranger in the market as someone who can help you find that happiness. This market exchange makes people less hostile, that is, less provoked to aggression or violence. Because if these guys downstairs were threatening people with a stick and saying, "Come in here and buy from me," you wouldn't come near the place. They have to be friendly. They have to keep the place clean. People have to know that if they eat there, they won't fall ill. So this encourages people to interact with one another. So market exchange is this, and trade liberalization to support market exchange encourages this kind of social cooperation, which is a very important aspect. The other aspect of this is that trade liberalization means that everyone must compete. You and I must compete as neighbors within a given country, but we also must compete with outsiders. Now, one of the reasons that many people would oppose trade liberalization, and indeed some business groups seem to be supporting this, this resistance to the Asean movement towards trade liberalization, because they have this misguided belief that they will be made worse off by increased trade. Now, it is true that some groups may be less well off after trade is expanded. But when you look at the overall impact of increased trade relations, you'll find that the people that are harmed would constitute a very small fraction of the total population, whereas the people that benefit from it will be an enormous proportion of the population. So what happens is that opposition to trade liberalization is really what we call a special interest argument. It's usually some labor groups or some industrial groups who benefit from some sort of state intervention that stops the rest of the people from being made better off. The primary beneficiaries of trade liberalization will be the poor. The primary beneficiaries of trade liberalization will be the poor. The poor consume almost all of their income. They have very little left for savings. So that means the poor are constantly stressed to find the best deal for their money. If you allow products in from around the world, the poor will be able to buy more and enjoy more on a given budget that they have. They will be the primary beneficiaries. The rich, I don't care about them. They can fly to Singapore from here, they can go to New York, they can go to Paris and buy it there, whatever they want. But the poor are the primary beneficiaries because they tend to be more static. The goods come to them. The rich can go to the goods. Don't worry about them. But if you interfere with this trade liberalization, the people who will suffer the most in the longer term will be the poor and to some degree the middle class. The people that will be benefited by restricting increased trade will be the established producers. And that will come at the expense of potential competitors. Now, if you are open to global commerce, not only do your consumers have access to the cheapest products and the best products and a wider range of quality of products, because not everybody wants to buy a Samsung. Some people can't afford it. They want to buy maybe a new handset made in India from a new company, or I'd like to buy Xiaomi, this new Chinese company, which has the same configuration as the iPhone 6, but it's sold for about half the price. So trade allows people to choose whatever range of quality they want, so they find the price that's right for them. Now, not only do consumers get a better deal, but domestic producers get a better deal, because domestic producers can source the raw materials that are the cheapest from anywhere in the world, which means that they'll be more competitive to be able to find domestic market share as well as potentially to export. So the interesting thing that's lost on many, even economists today, the message that Adam Smith left us with in his book, The Wealth of Nations, was that if you want to grow, you must import. The key to economic growth is to import. Now, unfortunately, many countries, like Japan, embarked on a development course based upon exports. And I say, unfortunately, Japan. Well, Japan was fortunate. Japan succeeded because nobody was competing with them. In the 1950s, in the 1960s, Japan had almost no competitors for export markets for its products. It was selling initially ceramics, toys, a few low-quality machine tools, okay? And at the same time, much of the West, especially the United States, wanted Japan to become a richer, more powerful country, to be a barrier against the advance of China. So it was all about geopolitics. So there was very little resistance for people to import from Japan because they wanted the Japanese economy to succeed. So Japan was accidentally successful by exporting. Because until even the late 70s, I mean, Hong Kong came along, and then slowly but surely Taiwan developed, and then Korea, and then Indonesia, and then Malaysia, and so on. These all came later. But until certainly the late 60s, Japan had no competitors. China wasn't in the game. The Soviet Union wasn't in the game. Forget Latin America, forget Asia, Africa. Nobody. So Japan had this sort of charmed existence. It was an accident in a way, a historical accident, that they succeeded with their export-oriented growth. It had to do with luck, or the fact that they didn't have aggressive competitors, and geopolitics, where there was little resistance. Now, what happened to Japan's export-led growth model? You didn't pay attention that in 1989 or 1990, it blew up in their face. Japan's economy collapsed in 1989, 1990. The stock market, the Nikkei index in Japan in 1989 was 36,000. That doesn't mean anything. Just today, it hit 20,000. Now, so from 1990 until 2015, they barely recovered half of its peak. So in other words, Japan wrote off 60% of the wealth on the stock market in 1989, 90, 91. The property market fell by 2/3. Now the good news for Japan is that they'd become very rich by then. So they could survive that. So that's the good news. The bad news is they've never recovered. They haven't fully recovered. They've been in a very slow growth phase. Japan went from a 6% growth rate over a 30-year period to a growth rate of less than around 1% since then. Now, the same thing happened in Southeast Asia. Part of the reason that Japan had its problems is that competitors came along. Who were the competitors? I just mentioned them. You guys. A lot of the ASEAN countries, plus Korea, Hong Kong. Okay, now, they had their day. And then 1997 came along. The same thing was happening. China was a big story by 1997. And Southeast Asia and other parts of East Asia began to see, as well as we begin to see the Soviet Union countries, Latin America, all these countries are now trying to compete for export markets. Every time a country or a group of countries tried to imitate Japan, they had their setbacks, like in 1997 in Southeast Asia. Now China has been able to survive longer primarily because of the nature of the global economy. By the time China began to develop its export markets, we had become globalized to an extent never experienced anywhere in the world. So China was able to ride that wave of globalization, much to its benefit. But it has never come close to the living standard that the Japanese developed. The per capita income of China is probably about 10% of what it is in Japan. So the living standards are quite minimal compared to what Japan achieved. So China's great success isn't really as remarkable as Japan's success, because Japan, in a way, started just as China did with Deng Xiaoping. Japan's economy was completely destroyed by the American bombs and by the Japanese wars of aggression. So it was completely destroyed. China's economy was destroyed by Mao and Maoists. But Japan had a much greater success, primarily because it didn't have competitors. It was able to accumulate much more wealth, much more rapidly, and of course over a smaller number of people. Again, roughly say a population of about 10% the size of China's. Now, does this mean that exports are wrong? Well, no, obviously these people seem to succeed. But the point is, imports provide your trading partners with the ability to buy from you. Imports provide your trading partners with the ability to buy from you. If you don't buy from the other person, how are they going to buy from you? I mean, you can think of it even within your own neighborhood. Imports provide the incentive for domestic producers to be competitive so they can sell to outsiders. Now, India had a closed economy. India, there were two producers of automobiles. Hindustan Motors was the primary producer. It had no export markets. Why? Because it was such a low quality product, because there was no competition. It was basically a monopoly. And it was an automobile suited primarily to Indian roads, but they never developed an export market. Nobody was interested in buying from them. And foreigners didn't trade with India because India had so many obstructions with license, tariffs, that made it very difficult to import products into India. Since 1990, India began to ride the wave of globalization, and its economy has performed much, much better than it did under Nehruvian socialism, which was primarily a sort of a planned economy with a great deal of obstruction in terms of economic activities. So trade liberalization is about empowering the people. This conference that we're attending is that they're looking for ways to empower the people. So this is my message. If you want to empower the people, and by what I mean by the people are individuals like you, each one of you. We are the people. The people is not some abstraction that people talk about in a conference. The people are individuals as individuals. You cannot make a forest healthy if you don't take care of the trees. So if you're talking about the people, and if you want to have what is known as people-centric development, you have to focus on the individual. And if you focus on the individual, you have to focus on individual rights, individual freedom, the capacity for people to choose. This will give them the means to find their own way in life. to improve themselves by their own efforts, not by the efforts of others. So this is, I think, something that we need to think about. If you want to empower people, especially as consumers, everyone is a consumer. You empower them by allowing them to choose what they buy, what the origins are, because they will be better off relative to their income. They will be empowered by that. And by the fact that there's competition. The competitive businesses have to please them. In a place like in India, or in China, or in the Soviet Union, the people had no power in the sense that as consumers, they had no power to influence the outcome of economic decisions. But look what you guys have done. The consumer has destroyed several major companies by ignoring them. Nokia. Nokia used to be the leader in cell phones. Some of you may not even have never owned a Nokia. I own several of them, quite a few of them. They were the best company. This is power to the people. The people say, no, I don't want that. BlackBerry. This was Motorola. These were big companies. These were terrifyingly large companies that had so much power. They could, Nokia was the largest economic power in the entire country of Finland. Almost as powerful as the government. But look what happened here. It didn't satisfy the people. This is people power. Exercised through the market. Voices. This is how you empower people. Give them access to markets. Not have power granted to elites or state-owned enterprises or monopolies protected by government policy. So another question in this conference is about human rights. Well, again, I'm deeply committed to human rights, but I think we have to be very careful about how we understand human rights. I understand human rights as rights of humans, that is, individuals, as individuals. The problem is many of these so-called human rights that are discussed will often be what you could call group rights. Now, group rights can be very dangerous. Group rights were the basis of the Holocaust. The German, under Hitler and the Nazi regime, granted special rights to the Aryan race. It was a racial-based group right. If you weren't an Aryan, if you were a Jew, a gypsy, a homosexual, or a deformed person, or maybe mentally unstable, you were subhuman. You were treated differently. In South Africa, there was a system known as apartheid. This was a system of group rights. Again, it was based upon white people that were a tiny minority, had certain rights that were not granted to the African majority. So this, because I lived in South Africa, I'm deeply skeptical about the value of group rights, and I'm worried about them. Now, the only way you can protect people, we all have to be seen as equal. I mean, I must say, even women's rights doesn't really draw me, because women are individuals. If you protect the individual as an individual, you don't care if it's a man or a woman. You don't care if they're white or black. You don't care if they're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu. You care that they're a human being, that they're an individual. They have rights on the basis of being alive, being humans. So another element of human rights is that some of these rights are what I would call constructed rights. To talk about workers' rights will often lead to a suggestion that people have a right to a job. Well, if someone has a right to a job, someone else has an obligation to give it to them. Is it your obligation? He wants a job. You say, well, my company's losing money. I can't keep him any longer, but he has a right to that job. But I have a right to my own survival. So I have an obligation to my family before I have an obligation to him. So we have to be very careful. All of these ideas are very seductive. They appeal to our emotion. A right to education. Well, a right to education means somebody else has an obligation to educate you. Now, do I have to pay for his education? Why should I say I don't have children? Why should I pay for other people's kids to be educated? Why shouldn't they pay for it? So, all of these human rights that are based upon anything other than individual rights are deeply problematic in my view. I lost my train of thought, so I've got a bit of a flu. Well, that may be a good time to pause for a question, because I've certainly given you some provocative statements here.
Would you like something to drink first?
No, I'm fine. I might have to go to the toilet then. Disrupt me further. Any questions?
How do we deal with the issue of if you open up trade, then you get big companies eating up all the smaller ones?
When I was a professor in South Africa many years ago, I mean this is an old story. People are always worried about big companies overwhelming small companies. But again, if that were true, Nokia would still be the biggest handphone maker in the world. Big companies can't survive forever because markets, competitive markets, hate monopoly. Competitive, as long as there's competition in the market, the big companies will have to compete for capital as well as for customers. If they're not innovative, they won't survive. Now, one story I was going to tell you. When I was a professor in South Africa, when I would visit these friends of mine in Johannesburg, on the way home we would often stop by and buy some beer to have with dinner. And we'd only want 4 or 5 beers. We didn't want just a few to have with dinner. And then one day we went by, and there was a big sign. They were making a big development across the street, right across the street from him. And this was something like a warehouse that sold beer and wine and liquor. It was one of the biggest companies in South Africa. And I asked this guy, I said, wow, I said, what do you think about that? And he was a small guy, and he was this large corporation. He said, I feel sorry for them. I said, what do you mean? He said, look at that. They've got to pay for the air conditioning for that big building. They got to pay the insurance. They got to hire hundreds of people. They got to stock an enormous inventory. He said, look at my business. So I'm not going to have any trouble. Let them try. And he was right. He offered convenience. He offered something they couldn't, because if I just wanted to get a couple of beers, I'd have to find a parking place, get out of the car, go in and fight my way through a big crowd, go down, Or So what we find is that, and even if some smaller businesses are displaced, there will be other opportunities that will open up, because or some of these small companies can be absorbed by growing companies. But the point is that competitive markets require that the businesses satisfy the customers, or they won't survive. So if the small businesses cannot satisfy the customer, they've got to find a different way to innovate. The customer should be king in this regard. We don't want to protect businesses per se. I think ultimately the message should be protect the consumer. Demand consumer rights. The consumer was the biggest loser in the Soviet Union and in China and in India. All the countries where they had central planning, where the governments control the economy, the last person to be satisfied was the consumer. And by the way, everybody is a consumer. So if you care about democracy, that is, you care about the people, you've got to care about the consumer. Not everybody is a worker. Not everybody is a manager. Not everybody is a government employee. But everybody is a consumer. So economic democracy should be about promoting the interest of the consumer, empowering the consumer. Because that's the way you support the people as individuals.
Yes, Prof. First of all, I would like to maybe thank the organizers of this forum for giving me this kind of opportunity to meet you and at the same time interact with them. But I'm really somehow amazed by the way you make the presentations, by the way in court. I think almost all the ideas you raised and your views can only be workable in an ideal situation.
Can only be
workable. That means they will practice in an ideal situation. What I mean by ideal situation is a situation whereby the environment itself, the citizens, and the government are pari passu, moving together. In a situation whereby the government is at the top, that is, the smaller indices of the people, a certain percentage of the people at the top of the ladder, as the boss here says, are eating on the larger population. For example, you have about 174 million people, and only a certain percentage, not more than 1%, are controlling the whole economy. How do you think the right of the consumer, trade liberalization, as you are saying, will be helping the masses?
because they are the consumers.
Even though they are the consumers, since
So
they
if you give consumers more choices and lower prices, how can you not help them? How does that not help the consumer?
it will not help because part of the social services is mainly provided by the government.
Well, okay, that is a bad beginning. And what we've seen is that where governments provide more services and more goods, people are worse off. Look at Venezuela, where the country is completely under control of government. They've run out of toilet paper, the most basic, easiest thing to produce. They can't manage to provide sufficient amounts of toilet paper. How can they satisfy the complex demands that individuals have? I mean, this is one of the great difficulties. One of the great thinkers in liberal economics, Friedrich von Hayek, said that what economics teaches us is a certain amount of humility, that we cannot plan such a complex social order. We need to understand that we don't know today, you and I don't know today what our demands will be tomorrow. Our demands tomorrow will be based upon, I found a 100 ringgit note on the ground, it rained, I need an umbrella, I see an ad for the Samsung S6 Edge, I didn't know it was a, whatever new information changes our demands, our interests, and other things influence our ability to buy these things. Now, so economics teaches us humility to understand that complexity so that we don't trust an elite at the top to perform or to provide the answers to the questions that we haven't asked yet. The questions that we haven't asked yet is, what do I want tomorrow? What makes me happy tomorrow? So it's only when I have more possibilities to decide what I want to buy and a range of qualities from anywhere in the world that I will have a much greater living standard, basically. So those countries where you have the most open economy, Singapore, have the highest living standards. Those countries that, like you described, say North Korea, Venezuela, Argentina, Cuba, places like that, they have low living standards. They have Myanmar, Burma, terrible living standards. India has low living standards, but getting better because they have moved away from this kind of approach where you have some people at the top deciding for everyone else. So I don't think this is an ideal. I think the real world experience, historical evidence, makes ample evidence that to support what I've said. This isn't just something I dreamed up out of a textbook. You know, again, I moved out from the U.S. in 1978, and I've lived in countries around the world. And I've used my training as an economist to kind of try to understand and analyze the way people live, the way people conduct their lives, especially their economic lives. And certainly my experience, my direct experience, again, confirms what I've just told you. That if you want to empower people, let them trade. Let them trade with their immediate neighbors and with people around the world. Globalization has been one of the great success stories of humanity. That is, globalization is, if anything, all about trade liberalization as well as capital flow liberalization. It's a bit of both. But without that, much of India would be much poorer than it is. Much of it, China would be much poorer than it is today without that. Now China's kind of a mixed bag here, isn't it? Because the government controls the politics much more rigorously than they control the economy. There's much more, China's moving towards trade liberalization. America's moving away from trade liberalization. America's doing worse today, I believe, because there's less liberalization. There's more and more regulations. There's more and more taxes. There's more and more interferences. More and more problems. And one of the other big problems is what we call regime uncertainty. If you're uncertain about what the future will hold with respect to taxation and regulation, you're less likely to make long-term investments. So America's got that. That's a real big problem in America. I think it's a problem in Europe too. But
how do you see this issue of IMF policy being imposed in some very, I can say, underdeveloped countries? How do you see the policy of IMF?
Well, I think the IMF is a misguided organization. It is opposed to trade liberalization. They're more about supporting governments than people. Now, most people have misguided narrative. I would like to see the IMF closed. I'd like to see the World Bank closed. These are two organizations that have outlived their usefulness. They've reinvented themselves. Now, the IMF needs economic crises to survive. If there were no economic crises, no financial crises, they wouldn't exist. So, if we look at the track record since 1984, going back to the so-called Latin American debt crisis, we've had an increased frequency of financial crises. Now, how effective is the IMF? If their whole reason for being is to stop financial crises from happening. No. They're there when they do happen, and they happily jump in because it justifies their existence. And one of the primary conditions they've come up with lately is to raise taxes. And if your economy is suffering, the last thing you want to do is take money out of the private sector. The only way you get economic growth is for the private sector to have more investment. If you raise taxes on the private sector, there will be less investment. The IMF should be closed. Now, and look what they've done. I mean, they've created what economists call a moral hazard. What they've done is send signals to countries. They say, if you get into financial difficulty, don't worry about it. You won't suffer. We will bail you out. So you're right. They've done an injustice to the people, but they supported governments. So governments survive. And governments expand because of the IMF, at the expense of the private sector, at the expense of the people as a consumer, and the people as a taxpayer. So, yeah, I find it very problematic what the IMF does. Now, every now and then they do give some good advice. I mean, they told Greece, someone said tonight that you have as many public sector employees in Malaysia as you have taxpayers. So for every one taxpayer, there's one public sector employee. Now, this is an unfair arrangement because you think any of those public sector employees would ever vote against raising taxes. Because if you don't raise taxes, they won't earn as much money. They won't have as many jobs. They won't have a nice office. So, you've got to control the growth of the public sector. And this is one thing that the IMF does say that's right, is that they generally have told countries that you've got to get your fiscal affairs in order. But that's just common sense. It should be. It's not like, this is against the people. No. This is in favor of the consumer because, look, if governments create a job, that creates a tax obligation to pay for that job. And he promised him a job in the private sector. And I say, well, hang on. I have to tax you to pay for his job. And then he says, whoops, I don't have a job anymore for you because I have to pay taxes for his job. Now, where was the job creation? None. There's no net creation here. One loss, one gain. So governments can't create jobs in that sense. They can only create tax obligations. And in doing so, they weaken the private sector. They take away funds from the private sector. So if the IMF gives that kind of advice, where they do, I agree with them. But lately, they just know that governments are irresponsible. Politicians are irresponsible. They don't want to cut taxes. They don't want to cut government growth. They want more government growth. They want more. Look, if you're in government, you have two strong, dominant interests, power and resources. To do good, you need more power. To do bad, you need more power. To do good, you need more resources. To do bad, you need more resources. So it's always a conflict of the public sector and the politicians against the interests of the people. Because more power to government officials, less freedom for the people. More resources for governments and politicians, fewer resources for the people. You want power to the people, less power to government. More power to government, less power to the people as individuals, as consumers, as taxpayers. Now, if you want to protect special interests like public sector employees, that's a special interest. Or you want to protect Petronas or some national champion or some domestic enterprise. But you're going to do that by disempowering the people. Any other?
I have a question. Okay, when you speak to people on the left, right, they are also the APF, and when you talk to them, a lot of them actually understand all the benefits of trade, the ones that you just spoke of. But the problem that they have is that trade does not benefit everyone equally. So they'll say things like, okay, fine, you have Singapore trades with Myanmar, for example. Myanmar has a comparative advantage in cheap labor. So what trade would do is it would foster cheap labor in Myanmar, and Singapore will benefit more to a greater extent than Singapore. So how would you respond to something like this? And also, as a result of freer movement of people, a country like Singapore, which has high wages, will tend to attract all the best minds from all these other countries, right? And the other countries will be comparatively worse off. So how would you address a fear like this that people have?
Well, the fundamental understanding has to be that trade is always a positive sum game. And I would argue that the people that you just mentioned that say that they understand the benefits of trade liberalization or worry about the uneven effects, that they don't understand trade. The fundamental aspect of trade is that I give you this in exchange for that only because I value what I get in return more than what I gave up. Okay? So trade makes both parties better off. Okay? Voluntary trade, I only give you what I have for what you have if I value what you have more than what I'm giving you. So I'm made better off by the trade. You're made better off because you're doing the same thing. You give up something you value less for something you value more. So trade is always mutually beneficial. Now, if you concern yourself about how some people will be made more better off than others, then I would say you're worried about the wrong problem. The real problem is, how are the poor? Now, are the poor made better off or worse off? Well, it's quite clear that trade has made most Chinese much better off. Some Chinese are extremely much better off. And almost all of them are better off to a considerable degree. Now, would you trade that for the old way, when everybody was equally miserable? Now, this is one of the problems. Say a football player. You like football. Malaysia's got good teams. Well, really? So, now, you want the best player to earn the same as the worst player. How good will your teams be? You'll have terrible teams. Your badminton champions, if you don't pay them for their performance, would you ever produce competitive badminton players? No. People earn in the market what other people believe they deserve. People earn in the market what other people believe they deserve. So whether or not it's Lady Gaga, a rock star, she makes infinitely more than I do. I have a PhD in economics. I work extremely hard. And I teach people deep, interesting ideas. And she's dancing around like a hooker. And she makes millions. That's not fair. Right? No, it's absolutely fair. Because she makes more people happy than I do. So the differential in payments is about making people happy.
No, but there's also this idea, right, that different countries are at different stages of their
It's up to the different countries. Countries are poor because their leaders make bad political choices.
But, okay, you take a country like Malaysia, right? Maybe 40 years ago, we were an agrarian-based economy, right? And we've moved on from that. As a result of our restrictive, we have high tariffs on cars, for example. And that allowed us to promote our own Proton and Perodua, right? So there's an argument there that can be made, right? We said, okay, at this present moment we are poor, yes, we are underdeveloped, but if we can protect our markets now, we don't liberalize, we can maybe foster our own. South Korea
It's
is
an illusion.
Japan.
No, you're wrong. In fact, India did that for nearly 50 years. And they stayed extremely poor. They were much more closed than you were. And India didn't have the raw materials, the natural resources that you have here. So you had those advantages that helped for you. And that was probably more important but what good has a domestic car industry done for you compared to, say, Thailand? Look at Thailand's automobile industry. They never had a national champion. And it's the center of automobile production for Asia, not just Southeast Asia. So they did much better by not following that line of protecting the domestic industry. They said, let's develop. People came and developed parts and then now cars and export millions of vehicles a year. You don't have that market. Thailand does. So you guys made a mistake in that regard. You didn't. That wasn't a success story, mine, by comparison. It's not my judgment, just looking at the facts.
So you don't believe that economic liberalization might lock countries in like different positions that they're currently in?
Economic liberalization?
It might lock countries in like their equilibrium, right? They might be.
No,
if you're an agrarian-based economy, for example, you would have a competitive advantage.
Markets don't like equilibrium. Markets are really about disequilibrium, because competition is about I want your market share.
Yeah, but currently I'm only good at producing like agrarian goods, for example, which are very low value added, right? So you can't make much money from it. So I'm very good at producing those things. You are very good at producing computers, for example. So we continuously trade. We can be locked in an equilibrium, right? Can't we?
No.
But I would never get the experience of producing computers because that's not my competitive advantage.
Okay. Look, again, India was a great agricultural powerhouse. And they've got some of the best IT engineers in the world. How did that happen? You know, there's so many counterfactuals to what you're saying. Usually what would happen, and what I've tried to do when I was in Nepal, because Nepal faces some interesting problems in the future. They got an agricultural base, and I said, okay, but what you need to do is produce high value added agriculture, branded, you know, like organic products from the high Himalayas, from the pristine environment, from glacial waters from 1 million years ago. Now, stupid people in America will go, oh my God, let me pay you 20 times what it's worth. Because I believe that I believe that nonsense, okay? People will pay for that. So if you're intelligent and if you have access to markets, you'll develop those kinds of ideas. So you're not doomed by anything other than your own self-imposed limitations. And those self-imposed limitations are what governments impose upon most of us. I mean, look at the Indian people, the Chinese people, whether that live in this country or live in their own countries of origin. Once they are released from the restriction placed on them by their governments, they thrive, they prosper. You know, I mean, America has so many productive Indians and Chinese that we were blessed with the tyranny of their governments. We offered them freedom from this tyranny, and they made us rich. Instead of staying home and making their own people rich. And who do you blame for that? I blame the government. I blame the government policy. The same in Africa. Africa's becoming the new place to go. It never was. I mean, 10 years ago, I always said I see great potential there. Most people, I don't know, potential, but now it's on everybody's tongue. Africa, that's the next big market opportunity. And what's happening is that some governments are beginning to allow much more openness. But then, it's going to take time. You got Zimbabwe, you got, basket cases. A lot of places. And it's politics, though. Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Southern Africa. And they import food now because of bad policies. So,
what are the major role of government in privatize the economy?
What
The major roles of government.
major role?
Yes.
Well, people who believe in a minimal state will say that government should provide security or defense, if you like, a system of justice or rules, and sound money, okay, a monetary system. And those are very important. Now, many countries don't provide good security for their people. They might provide defense, but that may have to do more with their neighbors. But the security, certainly like in Latin America and a lot of other developing economies, domestic security is not very good for the average citizen. It's very good for the politicians. And of course for the rich, they can afford to purchase private security. But to depend on the local police, like in Indonesia, where I'm most of the time, you don't want to go to the police unless you absolutely have to, because if you do, they know your address. They're going to come and look around. They're going to want, favors. They're going to want, or they'll find something. You want to stay away from it. They're not providing you with security. They provide you with insecurity. So here's a government failure. The most basic thing that government should do, provide security. Many of them fail to do it. Justice, good laws. You live in countries with deep corruption. Where's the justice? Justice would mean that all these corrupt officials would be in jail. Now, America has a decent system of justice. If you want to see some corrupt places, go to Louisiana or Arkansas. Now, these are deeply corrupt places. But the good news is, we put some of those people in jail. The guy that was governor after Bill Clinton went to jail for corruption. He was the governor of Arkansas. He was hooked up with the Riyadis in Indonesia. And you know where he lives now? Outside Jakarta, in a housing development owned by the Riyadis. But, these corrupt people were looking for a place in America where they can do business the way they do at home. So they went to Arkansas. That's where they met Bill Clinton. That's where they all got their start together. And they helped finance Clinton's accession. So where's the justice? We have corruption. Sound money. What country do you know that's guilty of having sound money, having reliable currency? The United States. It's an embarrassment to me. America had the trust of the entire world that we would provide a currency that was reliable, that was stable in value. This was the implicit and explicit agreement of the Bretton Woods Agreement. We moved away from a gold standard or gold commodity-based economy to a dollar standard economy because people said, America is a stable economy, we'll have a stable currency. We betrayed the trust of the entire world. Because the dollar is strengthening again against many currencies, but it has not been a successful, certainly hasn't been a sound currency. So, but those are the three things that most people, and I think, now, what happens is that governments wind up doing all sorts of other things that I think they shouldn't do. Governments don't need to provide education. Education can be provided and will be provided by the private sector without government involvement. In fact, in most countries, the poor are better served, especially in poor countries. The poor of the country, the poor in the poorest countries are better served by the private sector providers of education than they are by government schools. This is the case in almost every country I've experienced. Especially, say, in India, where the poor choose to send their children, the desperately poor. If you're poor in India, you're poor. And you want to see poor, go to India. They will send their kids to a private school instead of the government school. Why? Because if they send them to government school, they don't learn anything. And they don't teach English. There's not English language medium in the government schools. They want their kids to learn English so they can get a better job. So they send them to a private school. But it's a low quality private school. But they learn, they develop. And if the school is no good, they leave that school. If the teachers are no good, they get fired. If the school is no good, it closes because people won't go there. Not true of the government school. Bad teachers, they keep their jobs. Bad headmasters, they keep their jobs. The teachers don't come to teach, they keep their jobs. The schools never close. The kids never learn.
Charitable organizations.
Huh?
They are charitable organizations.
I'm sorry?
Charitable.
No, these are private, for-profit schools. Charitable schools can work too. But the private, for-profit schools in India are providing the best opportunity for the poor to be educated. We call them budget schools or low budget. These aren't the private schools of the rich and the elite. These are people that have very basic needs. And frankly, these are people that aren't planning to go to a university. They may, but they don't have an idea about that. So, governments provide a lot of things that the private sector should provide and would provide. But governments love monopoly. Markets hate monopoly. Did anyone ever take physics? There's an expression in physics. Nature hates a vacuum. So if a vacuum occurs in nature, it's punished, right? Liquid or something goes in it, right? It's the same with markets. Markets hate monopoly. Because monopoly means that you're making very high profits and you're not producing very much. That gives me an opportunity. I sell for less, I provide more. As long as I can do that, the monopoly is going to lose its position. So, and dominant players, like I say, Motorola, Nokia, they didn't abuse their position by any means. I mean, they made nice profits and all, but they still got the stuffing beat out of them because of competition. Now look at Microsoft. Is Microsoft a monopoly? No. It competes with SAP, Apple, Linux. There's not so many other. In terms of operating systems, there's only a couple, but Microsoft, does Microsoft overprice its product? No. It's cheap because it's on every laptop in the world, right? Does it underproduce? No. It doesn't behave like a monopolist. A monopolist tries to keep excessively high profits by restricting output and charging a high price because nobody's competing with it. But Microsoft has done the opposite. So it's not a monopolist. And that's why it's survived as long as it has. If they had approached the market the way Apple did it, because Apple did that, Apple wouldn't let anybody else produce, use its operating system, right? And it kept high profit. Now, if Microsoft had done that, Microsoft would have been enormously rich, much richer. So I see very limited role for government. Again, from experience and from, I think, theoretical arguments. If you want to empower the people, you have to have less interference in their lives. You have a good rule structure. We call it the rule of law. Now, governments can contribute to that in terms of promoting the rule of law, helping people understand the rule of law. But the rule of law is something that you could write on a small piece of paper. You know, using very just basic, don't kill people, don't rob people, don't cheat people, be honest in your dealings. Okay, that sounds like a pretty good community to me. Why do we need legislators that every day introduce new laws? Legislation is one of the great abominations of the modern world. Nobody can know all the laws. So all of us are probably breaking many, many laws every day by leading a peaceful life. Simply because there's so many laws that you have to be breaking some law.
The MPs have to do something.
I'm sorry?
The MPs have to do something.
Yeah.
At least they have work.
And this is what, you know, in America we had these government shutdowns. Well, and then people kept complaining, you know, that was bad. Well, they weren't doing anything. That's good. They weren't interfering with my life. That's good. And then they talked about gridlock, that no laws were being passed. That's good. We don't need more laws. We've got basic law. People, if you just, now, the market, exposure to the market makes people understand the rule of law. The rule of law, in my mind, is, you know, peaceful interchange, honesty, commitment to your word, fulfilling your promises, in other words, contracts. You know, once you have that, we don't need all of these other laws. You need a few general laws. You know, you have one law. Do not murder someone. Imagine we say, do not murder him. Oh, I can murder him. Oh, I can murder him. No. You need one general law. Do not steal from him. Okay, I can steal. No. You need one general law. You don't need thousands of pieces of legislation. And again, this is where governments get it wrong. We say that we want government to oversee a system of justice and a system of rules, but they keep wanting to make more and more rules based upon their own preferences or the preferences of an elite or of what we could call a momentary majority. Sometimes we become, remember years ago when people complained about spam? You guys maybe are not old enough to have been overpowered by spam, but they wanted to make a law against it in many countries. And happily they didn't, because technology took care of it. But if in order to block spam, you'd have to block a lot of other aspects of freedom of expression. Okay, so people, if we allow governments to make everything we don't like illegal, everything will be illegal. Because we all don't like something that the rest of us like. We have to be very careful what we ask of government. We're asking of government too much, And they're offering too much in return as well, too many. And that's inevitably interferences with somebody's free choice. Power to the people. Empower individuals. Empower individuals by giving them access to more market opportunities. This would be my message to this group and to this organization we're speaking with tomorrow. So,
Okay, I have one last.
yeah,
You know what-
I think he had a question.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Oh no? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
You and after.
Oh, yeah, you go first, please. 'Cause
Yeah.
I already asked.
Okay. Alright. I just want to ask about if we have maybe one company, one large company, a big company. They have around 20,000 workers. Okay, and unfortunately they have a problem. Their company have a problem, and they want to reconstruct the company, and they agree to maybe fire around 6 to 7,000. Don't you think that the who has been fired? It will be affected. No, it will be affect the market because they also have a family that want to take care, and they have children. So because yeah.
Well, you know, look, I have an instinct that I try to teach my students. Whenever I see a serious economic problem, and this may not be terribly, it's like you say, if it's involving a large number of people, a serious economic problem, cultural problem, social problem, political problem, I ask myself, where is the government policy behind it? Okay, now in this case, I would say, okay, why does that company employ 20,000 people? Did they employ 20,000 people because they were protected by a tariff or a quota? Well, they should never have been that large. Those people should never have been employed there if it was based on that. So the problem was created. You know, you say, oh, wow, if this transition is going to affect so many people, but those people would have been found employment somewhere else, presumably, because they wouldn't have been employed there. Now, when companies are able to charge higher prices in order to maintain large staff, that means that other people who are buying whatever they sell have less money to spend on other things produced in the economy, so that other areas of the economy don't prosper or grow. And this is the serious problem. And this is why people are constantly asking this question. In economics, we talk about the seen and the unseen. We can see these 20,000 jobs, but we don't see, the unseen part of it is what would have happened if the government protection that allowed that company to become so large hadn't been there. There would have been many other small companies based upon the consumer's ability to spend money elsewhere. But then we say, oh, the government created this problem, now we want the government to fix it. But that's not a solution. That's more of the same. So, government interventions create distortions that create demands for more government intervention, that create distortions, that create demands for more intervention. So we have this endless cycle. So we have to break that cycle. We have to say, and we will, unless we ask that question, was a government policy behind that problem? People are going to turn to fix it. And inevitably they can't fix it. They can just make a mess out of something else. So this is what happened in the 2007, 2008 housing bust in America. The US government did 180 degrees the wrong thing. They created the problem. It was created by monetary policy and by some supporting legislation. The problem occurred, and then they said, oh, let us fix it. Because nobody saw that they were the source of the problem. So people said, oh, please save us. So It's a real problem. Now, if the economy grows more rapidly, displaced people from one company will be better able to find new jobs if there's economic growth. And there'll be more economic growth if there's more trade liberalization. The other thing that's sad about this, if a big company hires 20,000 people, they say they hired me 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So I work for them and they can no longer keep me as a worker. Now I'm 55 or 60. Who's going to hire me? So I was trapped in a job that should never have existed. Now that I'm released from that job, I can't find a job because I'm too old. That's unfair. Power to the people. Give people access to better choices. Did you? Oh, you got it. Keep it. You're moving this thing. I keep thinking. Okay.
We really should have passed.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Okay,
I'll ask you.
Last question?
Okay, actually it carries on like from what he said. I was going to ask you what do you do to the losers from market exchanges, right? But from a policy perspective, I agree with what you just said, but from a policy perspective, what would you do actually to help these people? Because you can't just say that, oh, your
Let
jobs
them go, yeah.
your jobs wouldn't have been around had the government not intervened in the first place.
Yeah,
You can't do that.
yeah. You mean not as a policy response, as a political response? Because it's different. A political response, you've got to worry about what's the political fallout. Well, I'm an academic. I don't have to deal with those problems. You know, but I'm not foolish enough to realize that these people face these difficulties. But what we did see, like in the United Kingdom, when Margaret Thatcher introduced privatization, when she broke the power of the unions to strangle the economy, the unions in Great Britain did not support the workers, they supported the unions. They harmed the people. They shut down the country. Is that power to the people? If the unions can shut down the country with a general strike, is that power to the people? No, the people can't go to work. The people can't be fed. They can't engage in commerce. No. Now, many people were displaced. But over time, the economy, because it grows, it absorbs it. So you have to be willing to be committed to the political fallout. And Thatcher, in her case, did that. She survived. Ronald Reagan, the air traffic controllers, wanted to shut down America. They said, we're going to go on strike and no airplanes can take off or land. Is that going to help the people? I can't go see my sick grandmother. I can't go to my job. I can't go back to the university. My goods can't get to market. Is that power to the people? No. He fired them all. This is a highly specialized job. He fired them all. They were federal employers. Said, you can't strike. You're fired. Because this will hurt the people. I want the people to be in power. Not you to be in power to force the people to do what you want. But of course, even with that highly special, air traffic control is highly special. They were able to, you know, in the end, only about 600 or 800 of them actually lost their jobs. The others that cooperated came back. Okay, but you can't let, you know, it's like it is in Germany recently. The pilots for Lufthansa were on strike. Well, this disrupted all of Europe. In fact, many places in the world. The French do it all the time. It disrupts everybody's life. Power to the people. I want people to be empowered. Truly. I want other people to understand what that means. And I don't think they understand what it means. Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to meet you.